John with his own podcast, Around the Political World with John Rothmann. And what have you been concentrating on that podcast, John?
We've covered Donald Trump extensively. We've covered Project 2025 because two key nominees that Trump is putting in place are part of that, which he denied was going to happen. We've talked about what's happening in education. I don't know if you have the story, but the superintendent of schools in Oklahoma, a fellow named Ryan Walters, a Republican, announced that, well, everybody has to pray now, and they're going to have Bible lessons. And that's being followed by Texas.
Yeah, Texas is doing the same thing, right?
I mean, it's.
What's the matter, John? You don't think a little prayer right now is appropriate for the schools? Is that what you're telling me?
I want you to know, every time I agree to appear with you, I say a silent prayer so that I will know that I'm okay. I did the same thing all the way through school, particularly at finals. But
if it's a government,
did you buy a Donald Trump Bible?
I have not purchased them. I don't know.
You're selling merchandise, for God's sake. Why don't you pick up the Donald Trump
Well,
Bible?
we'll remind everybody that the state of Oklahoma, to which John has referred, actually has purchased $3 million worth of those Bibles because it was basically a gift to Donald Trump. They wanted Bibles that had both the Bible and the Declaration of Independence included. So that was like the stipulation for them to buy it. And the only Bible that has such a thing is the Trump Bible made in China.
It's just unbelievable.
Now, look, I'm not a Trump fan. I'm sorry. That's an expressed bias on my part, so I don't mean to always dump on Trump. But it is weird how people who are in official positions, like in Oklahoma, they have created ways, essentially, to curry favor with the president-elect. So let me go back to this situation, though, with religion in the schools, because it's an important distinction, I think, that need be made, and that is that government schools, right, schools with government funding, the implication on your part, I think, is there shouldn't be prayer in those schools, correct?
Exactly, 100%.
So parochial education
doesn't matter. Parochial schools, private school, they can do whatever they want.
Sure. So this is something that, as you say, is something of a contagion in those states, Oklahoma, Texas. Do you see challenges as viable in any way? I mean, there will be court challenges to this.
There certainly should be, and it depends who nominates the judges. As you pointed out, the Trump people are furious because Biden has nominated judges. The Trump people want to pack the courts. And you will recall we talked about the fact that we did not just vote for a president, we voted for the appellate courts, the Supreme Court, the federal courts. All of those courts are now going to be affected profoundly.
Do you see the constellation of people that will inhabit this new administration as we've seen these nominees be revealed through the days? I mean, it's almost like it feels like a reality show, the way one is shocking, the other is completely unexpected. Do you see, as I do, that he'll get the lion's share of these nominations through?
I think if they go to recess appointments, which they may well do, there is no Senate confirmation. I would remind you, John Bolton, who was a frequent guest on KGO, was ambassador to the UN, but was a recess appointment because he couldn't muster the votes in the Senate. So my expectation is, and Donald Trump talked about this early on, before the election, that he would rely on recess appointments. And that clued me off, and frankly, I find it unconscionable. The idea that members of the Senate would agree to recess appointments, abdicating their responsibility for advise and consent, is very disturbing.
Isn't it the case, though, John, that he would likely get these through even with a Senate majority?
I don't know. We don't know what the Republicans are going to do. Now, the Republicans in the Senate are asking for the report on Matt Gaetz. The Speaker of the House, who has tremendous power, is saying, no, we don't want to release it. After all, he's not a member of Congress anymore. And once you cease to be a member of Congress, this kind of information shouldn't get out. Now they're using the excuse that it's not completed. I mean, Mark, it's the vetting process when you work in administration is absolutely critical. And we have had nominees for the cabinet rejected over the years for various reasons. But what is being proposed now is beyond the pale. I have to tell you, it's
Now, why do you say
Violates
that?
every sense of it.
It's beyond the pale. You're talking about the recess appointments. That's beyond the pale. It's
Yes.
not. Yeah. Okay. Like the guy's
And I
allowed
would
to.
say much of what he's doing, had he revealed Matt Gaetz as Attorney General, if he had revealed Robert Kennedy Jr. as the head of Health and Human Services.
Well, just to, again, I don't mean to always push back on Brother Rothmann, but just to kind of represent the argument, I think he doesn't mind it. I think he was clear. I mean, RFK Jr. campaigned with him, endorsed him.
No, you will recall that one of his key aides said RFK Jr. would not become Health and Human Services, and that man, who was the co-chair of the Transition Committee, is now going to be Secretary of Commerce.
That's right. So you see them up in front
of you. Not that I want to correct you. Let me assure you.
No. But there was some cognitive dissonance there because you're right. Lutnick on Fox News said RFK Jr. isn't going to be ahead of HHS. But Trump had made clear that he was going to put RFK Jr. in charge of making America healthy again, et cetera. He left it somewhat
Health
vague.
Czar is very different than the head of HHS.
Yeah, fair enough.
You understand, the staff there has to respond to whoever is in charge. I mean, this is, and by the way, how do you feel about fluoride being taken out of water? I mean,
honestly, of all the things that he's proposed, doesn't even move the meter for me. I think that one of the great advances in American medicine and one of the great advances in human medicine through the generations has been the elevation of vaccines to the point that we've actually been able to more or less eliminate some deadly, horrifying illnesses.
Look what Robert Kennedy Jr. went to Samoa.
And the idea that you could...
Kennedy Jr. went to Samoa, advocated against the measles vaccine, and they had an outbreak of measles, which caused the death of a number of people.
Sure.
I mean, there is a cause and effect here.
Well, I mean, and rubella and all of these other horrible illness, polio, smallpox. These are all
things.
Thank
God for the polio vaccine. I'm old enough to remember when polio broke out and we couldn't go in swimming pools.
Sure.
And I remember when the Salk vaccine was created. And I remember the sugar cubes. I remember it all. Yeah. Thank God.
These diseases were a scourge, really, on humanity.
That's right. Absolutely, 100%.
So when you put fluoridation of water up against it, I think it is not. But again, I mean, I don't mind.
Talk to dentists. Have a few dentists on your program to talk about how our dental health is improved because of fluoride in the water. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you liked going to the dentist as a kid. I hated it.
Well, I will say this, and this is we'll move on from RFK Jr. But the thing that makes RFK Jr. problematic to me, anyway, as I look at him, is that some of what he says makes sense. Like the obesity problem in America is a substantial one.
Huey Long made statements that made sense. It didn't mean he should have been president of the United States. And there are leaders of other nations that we could mention, but we don't want to because it creates a whole different context, who did great things. Remember the trains ran on time? Come on. It's unbelievable to me.
It's against the backdrop of his controversies that this guy is ascending into a Trump administration and will likely be in charge of some very high-end medical strategies moving forward. I'm talking about the CDC, NIH. I mean, these are places where some breakthrough research.
And Tulsi Gabbard. Please don't forget Tulsi Gabbard. She will control 18 intelligence agencies. And
she,
well, look, may I say a word positively?
Please. Yeah.
Marco Rubio for Secretary of State makes great sense. He's very able. Elise Stefanik at the United Nations, again, a good pick. So what you have to do is to realize that advise and consent by the Senate, where there are real investigations and real hearings, are critical. And if those hearings are dispensed with, well, it presents an amazing problem. If you go to recess appointments, there are no hearings. It's just astounding.
The deportation of so many, I mean, he's talking about, let's just take the figure 10 million. I don't think it'll ever happen. As I've told you, I think I've told you, I've certainly told people who've watched the show, I think it'll be very high profile, heartbreaking, by the way, deportations that will be almost have a theater to them because they want those headlines out there, these mass deportations. But the reality is there isn't the infrastructure, there isn't the money to pay for the kind of mass deportations they're talking about. And
he's
now,
using the military. He's announced he will use the military. Let me remind you, and I remind all of our listeners, most people have never heard the name Thomas Homan, Homan, with a Heritage Foundation, who is now going to be the czar of deportation, and who wrote that section of the 2025 report, which Donald Trump says he has nothing to do with. When you really dig into this and you read the 2025 report and you realize key people who wrote that report from the Heritage Foundation are now getting key roles in the administration, including Homan, well, this is something that scares the living bejeebers out of me. I want you to know what people who are of Hispanic descent, even who were born in this country, are being advised, carry your passport just in case. That's where we are.
According to Pew Research, unauthorized immigrants live in 6.3 million households. 70% of them are mixed status. That means they are U.S. citizens and immigrants residing in the country legally.
Absolutely.
And living in these various homes. Only 5% of mixed status households, unauthorized immigrants, lived with people who were not family, suggesting that most undocumented migrants live with a family member who is a U.S. citizen or legal resident. So there's talk, and now there is conflicting talk about it, that there would be U.S. citizens that would be related, family I'm talking about, deported alongside those who are in this country
that's speculation. The fact that you and I have to even discuss this at this point in the history of the United States of America is absolutely astounding, disturbing, horrifying. And I have no other words to describe it. Look, you can have nominees for a president's cabinet who you like and who you don't like. But when the president-elect of the United States talks about recess appointments, puts these kind of people in position of power, potentially, and the Republicans in the Senate are so intimidated by it that they may not do their job. And when you have the Speaker of the House, I mean, I have to tell you, in my worst nightmare scenario, I could not have imagined this.
It is true.
Am I being blunt enough?
No. Could you crank it up? You got it about 8. I think 10 would be useful. I do think that the economic impact of deporting all these people is so immense. And the business community, I noticed this, I noted this yesterday or the day before, and I've noted it along the way for years, of course, that the underlying aspects of the American economy depend so much on many of these people who don't have legal status here. I mean, the agricultural concerns alone in the Central Valley are essentially completely dependent on that workforce. There will be pushback, and that's why I say you're going to see a lot of deportations, hundreds of thousands, and it's going to happen quickly.
And you're going to see the military used for that purpose, which Donald Trump pledged to do, and which I would remind you, General Milley, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said he wouldn't allow it. By the way, we didn't even talk about Pete Hegseth, who is the Secretary of Defense designate.
I
watched him on Fox. I've watched him for years. Come on, give me a break. Secretary of Defense. You know, I remember when John F. Kennedy took Bob McNamara out of Ford Motor Company. But Bob McNamara had experience. He had depth, and he may have been a Republican, but everybody acknowledged he was brilliant.
Yeah. That was sort of the part of that Best and the Brightest. McNamara in that Halberstam book was talked about that way. Hegseth, I don't know. He's certainly quite controversial. He's a true neophyte. You know, you have to run the Pentagon, which is an organization of immense proportion. The Department of Defense, 2 million plus employees. So you have to have some managerial experience, which he does not have. I, again, think that Trump will get that appointment through for some of the reasons to which you've referred. I think he has cowed the senators to the point that they're ready to play ball.
And that's what's so appalling. By the way, you're going to talk in the next hour about the environment. Look, Lee Zeldin, former congressman, defeated for governor of New York. has been nominated to be Environmental Protection Agency head. He's opposed to environmental protection, for God's sake.
That's absolutely true. I mean, that's an appointment that's designed to continue a Trump strategy of dismantling some of these government agencies like the EPA. He may do some
Department of Education
and the Department of Education. On the deportation, I'm seeing in the chat. Do you think there should be? Well, let me just see. We've got Rothmann offers no alternative plan that would deport anyone. No alternative plan. Not even 1 in 100.
You're right. And the reason is because the President of the United States has the power to nominate for cabinet offices. Let me remind you that when you put a Stephen Miller in as Deputy Chief of Staff of Policy, that's not requiring Senate confirmation. That is simply an appointment the president can make to his own staff. So look, it's not, I don't want to be negative. I mean, I was not for Donald Trump. I have real concerns about Donald Trump, but I want to know from the Trump supporters out there, do you think these are creditable nominees? Some of the names we've mentioned? Do you understand what the implications are? And I think that is the key. And the tragedy here is, as somebody who believes in the integrity of the United States Senate, you see the Republicans rolling over. It's beyond my comprehension.
Yeah, I don't have the faith in any of these institutions that you do. We've visited that a few times, Linger. What's Rothmann's plan regarding the millions who are here illegally? Can't deport all of them, obviously, but we need to do something. And let me just tag this, and then I'll let you speak. It is true that Trump probably won this election on that issue in a big, big way. He won it on illegal immigration. So something had to be done, and he is now following through with this. Again, he's representing it and advertising it as this intense upgrade to the existing immigration policy. What would be an appropriate policy is kind of what Randy's asking you, John Rothmann. You can't deport all of them, he says,
rounding up illegals. Yeah. There's no problem with rounding up illegals and deporting them. We're talking about millions of people. We're talking about establishing, and this is seriously being suggested, transit camps on the Mexican border on the Texas side. We're talking about a complete disruption of the way this country operates. Now, you asked me what my alternative is. My alternative was not to vote for Donald Trump. Pure and simple. Sure. But he's now the president, and he has to be dealt with.
What would be just to follow up then, what would be, well, John's essentially saying, I have no problem with rounding up illegals. I would imagine that when you say that, I'll get to this, Peter, comment in a second. When you say that, I presume you mean the rounding up associated with those who have run afoul of the law? I mean, where do you say rounding up? What does that mean? We
should be doing that. But that's not what Donald Trump is talking about.
I get it, but I'm just trying to answer the viewer's question, which is, and what would your plan be, or what would a plan that you might endorse be?
I would have followed the plan of the Obama and Biden administrations. If you are here illegally, you should be removed. Period. I have no problem with that. Nobody has. Do you remember the president?
So let me just follow up on.
Do you remember the president who was called the deporter in chief? It was Barack Obama, for God's sake.
So you'd have no problem with going into the lettuce fields and rounding all those people up in the strawberry fields?
You just made something very interesting. A criminal who commits murders or rapes, but the people who work in this country, who are here illegally, let me remind you, Dwight Eisenhower had a program called the Bracero Program, which worked quite well, where people who were here illegally but wanted to work here, registered, and it was fine. And I would even remind you, Ronald Reagan had a similar program here in California. There are ways of doing this. It means that people who are here illegally, who violated the law, may be able to stay and work, but it also means that there's no excuse for a murderer or a rapist. But do you remember what Donald Trump said? That nations were releasing from their prisons massive numbers of people who were committing crimes. Where are they, for God's sake? There aren't massive numbers. There are individuals.
So it's draconian is your point. All right. So Peter says John Mark Miller, the chief of staff, said that if you are housing an illegal alien, you can also be prosecuted for aiding and abetting an illegal immigrant because now they are criminals. Again, this is the extension of the Trump policy. Yeah, it's true. And
Yeah,
this kind of goes
ridiculous.
into the.
Do you remember what Miller said? America for Americans.
Yeah.
That's what he said.
The situation beyond this administration just got far more intense in Ukraine. I wonder if you could give me a moment on that, John, because the reality of what's happening with Russians being threatened by missiles fired from Ukraine has taken this conflict to a whole other level. And now, last thing, the Americans have closed the embassy in Kyiv, expecting some kind of Russian response that could be quite serious.
Remember, Ukraine is an independent nation now, so there is an embassy. In the old days, when I was there, it was a consulate because it was still part of the Soviet Union. Look, the Ukraine is escalating. Vladimir Putin has just revised the nuclear doctrine. It was announced yesterday, very publicly. Let me remind you that we are now permitting Ukraine to fire long-range missiles into Russian territory. He couldn't do it until we gave permission. On top of that, we're now providing landmines, which we are told are being used very carefully. Have you ever seen a landmine used carefully, for God's sake? This is an escalation. What worries me, and I was asked the question yesterday in another interview, I was asked the question, what are the dangers of nuclear war? Let me remind people, you can fight a limited nuclear war. You don't have to blow up the world. We know that from Hiroshima. You can hit directly with a low-grade, what we now call a low-grade nuclear weapon. It doesn't have to be a thermonuclear war. I'm not worried about San Francisco or Los Angeles being bombed, but I'll tell you what they are worried about in Europe. I was just there a few months ago. In Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, in Poland. And let me tell you who's very worried. The Russians are worried because they understand there will be tit for tat. And the Germans are worried. In fact, the Germans are stepping up their aid to Ukraine. But without the United States, Ukraine cannot win. Zelensky knows that. Not that we can win, but now let me remind you of the most important thing of all. Donald Trump has said he has a plan. I want to know what his plan is. And do you remember he said he might be able to implement it even before he took office? Well, if ever there was a time for Donald Trump to pull a rabbit out of the hat, this is it.
Well,
Zelensky
it was just that.
I mean, Ukrainians are absolutely horrified.
That was propaganda, as we all know. There's no way that he can.
No, it was a statement. You may call it propaganda, but it was a statement which he ought to be held accountable for, given the escalation of tensions.
I have in my last minute with Rothmann. There was something else from a listener. Phineas says, Mark, talk to Rothmann about Gaza and Lebanon and anti-Semitism in Europe and the USA. Well, there's a lot there. But
I can't do that in a minute, Mark. But everybody should know that the Trump administration position is slightly different than the Biden administration. Governor Huckabee is now going to be the ambassador of the United States to Israel. He is more sympathetic to the Likud and to Netanyahu. No question about it. And so there is a change, and there is talk now, just talk, of Israel being given the green light to annex settlements in the West Bank. In return, the areas not annexed could constitute a Palestinian state. But there is real opposition to that by the Israelis, not because they're opposed to the Palestinians having something, but because if a Palestinian state is created, it might be run by Hamas. They would win an election. That's why Mahmoud Abbas has not held an election in years. So the Israelis are asking, look what happened in Gaza. We have an area of the West Bank, but you know from that narrowest point, it's only 9 miles from the Mediterranean Sea to what would be a Palestinian state. Look, I know people who jog 9 miles every day. Let me assure you I'm not one of them. But I say this to you because American policy is going to change dramatically. There is also, if I may observe, a change in terms of the relationship between Jews in America and Jews in Israel. About 75% of Jews in America voted for Kamala Harris. But if Jews in Israel had voted in the American election, if they were American citizens, there's no doubt that about 70% would have voted for Donald Trump because they view Donald Trump as more friendly to Israel's interests. So this is a highly complex, difficult position. And let me tell you something. If, in fact, these major changes take place, there will be a great debate in the Jewish community in the United States. I spoke recently at a synagogue, and I suggested to the rabbi, who is very much in favor of a two-state solution, that even Israelis are not in favor of a two-state solution now because they're afraid of Hamas. Now, is there a chance for a deal with Lebanon? The answer is yes, and let me explain why. Because it does not involve creating a Palestinian state. It does not involve the Palestinian Authority, which has proved to be useless. But with Lebanon, remember, Lebanon as a country is very loosely formed, and that Hezbollah has tremendous power. And the Christians in Lebanon would rather see the Israelis in charge of stopping Hezbollah. So we'll see whether or not a deal can come.
What about the anti-Semitism in Europe and in this country, John?
Huh?
What about the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe and in this country?
It's horrific. It's horrific. There was a pogrom in Amsterdam, for God's sake. I was in Amsterdam just a few months ago. My cousins who live in France have taken the yarmulkes off their head, the Stars of David from around their neck. They are absolutely terrified. And in this country, you know that the Diary of Anne Frank was done in Detroit. And the neo-Nazis, and I hate to say it, radical Islamists, were out protesting the showing in a play of the Diary of Anne Frank. And I don't have to quote myself on this. Look what the king said. The king, after the pogrom in Amsterdam, said, "We failed the Jews before the Holocaust, and we have failed them again." Now, that is not a Jew speaking. That's the king of a sovereign country. So Jews are very concerned. And if you will take note, around synagogues, around the country, if you listen to the sermons delivered during the high holidays, virtually every rabbi spoke about the rise of Jew hatred. I say this with some regret, but I think it is something we have to grapple with. And it is a deep and abiding concern.
Well, on that rather a down note, we will have to wrap this conversation. However,
I want to know what the criticism was of you.
I will share with you. Let me finish. If you'll let me finish.
I hate letting you finish. Go ahead. You think it was your show, Mark?
When you left last time, I did my Rothmann impression. You know, I've been doing it for years. You've heard it, and you're like family, and I know you get a kick out of it. And I was called out for it by Kathy in Campbell. Campbell is near the Bay Area. And she says, "I think that's disrespectful that you mock John Rothmann in this way." I'm not mocking John. It's an impression of John. You know how he speaks with that? He has that way. I always say, I love what John Rothmann says. I don't always understand it, but I love the way he says it. And it's just a thing that I do. So I mean, for anyone who would take it, I think it's just Kathy, but
I'm not offended at all.
Yeah.
I do want everybody to know Mark and I are good friends. It doesn't mean we agree on everything. And that's the dynamic of the show. And as for impersonations, when I was in high school, Mark, my nickname was Mighty Mouth. So all I can tell you is, my dear friend Mike Wise did a column. So I'm not offended at all. In fact, you should hear when I get my friends together some of the impressions they do of my stentorian tone.
Yes, that's exactly it, a stentorian tone. John, look forward to your next podcast, which is a daily offering around the political world.
I am going to be away for 10 days, so there will be no podcast. And Mark, with deep regret, profound apologies, you'll have to find another way to fill this time next Wednesday.
Next Wednesday, we'll
have a wonderful Thanksgiving, and I'll be back the week after.
I look forward to that. You too, my friend. John Rothmann, everybody. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.